Welcome to Crossing the Chasm. I am delighted today to speak to Nina Stender, who leads the Rapid Response Cooperative Development Project at the Democracy at Work Institute, DAWI. Her work focuses on creating pathways to entrepreneurship and expanding economic opportunity for historically excluded workers. Nina's passions for cooperatives was shaped by her experience at the Brownsville Community Justice Center in Brooklyn, where she learned about worker co-ops as a tool for economic self-determination. DAWI is a worker self-directed nonprofit which allows Nina to serve as a member director on the organization's board. She also sits on the board of Legislative Llama Facts, a nonprofit civic education app, and is an advisor to Co-op Hudson Valley, a member of Seed Commons. She is a former board member of the Kingston Food Co-op. Nina holds a BA in Social Studies and Government from Wesleyan University and is a graduate of the Certificate in Workplace Democracy and Community Ownership at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. She was a Public Affairs Fellow at the Coro New York Leadership Center in 2017-2018 and a Social Change Fellow at the SUNY Colin Powell School for Civic and Global Leadership in 2021-2022. Nina is a current fellow in the 2025 Cooperative Leaders and Scholars Program. Nina brings a wealth of expertise and insight into worker-owned cooperatives, and this conversation goes deep into what they are and how they function in our society and what role they can play in ameliorating some of those problems. I really enjoyed talking to Nina and hope you enjoy the conversation. Thanks for listening. Nina Stender, welcome to Crossing the Chasm.
Thank you so much for having me, Brian.
It's great to have you. I'm looking forward to the conversation. And I want to begin, if you could you please identify the chasm or chasms you see in society that relate to your work and interests?
Absolutely. A lot of my work and my interest is around creating an economy that is inclusive to all people, that allows them a way to participate meaningfully and have dignified work in order to have a dignified life. And our capitalist economy and government are, largely driven by the pursuit of profit, favor the interests of large corporations and wealthy stakeholders. So this has led to the marginalization and neglect of a lot of communities that don't hold economic or political power, like low-income folks, people of color, immigrants, rural communities. And so as a result, these communities often face systemic barriers to basic needs, such as stable and dignified work, housing, other essential services. And, my work really centers around cooperatives, and cooperatives have historically emerged in response to this type of exclusion or neglect or being underserved by traditional markets and employers or public institutions. And when they failed to provide that kind of adequate access and inclusion in the economy. So co-ops really allow communities to respond to this in a grassroots way, to pool resources, share risks and opportunities and benefits, and really to build economic autonomy. I was first introduced myself to worker co-ops in a meaningful way in the context of working at the Brownsville Community Justice Center in Brooklyn about 7 years ago, in a context where youth who had been impacted by the justice system were seeking ways to create economic opportunity for themselves and figure out how they could participate in the economy in a way that still allowed them to maintain economic autonomy. And also in the context of being in a community, Brownsville, that has had a long history of disinvestment and marginalization, a lack of opportunities, a lot of very scrappy young people who were interested in creative ventures and entrepreneurship and wanted to explore what it looked like to do entrepreneurship in a collective way. And at the same time, there's a lot of unmet needs in this community. For example, lack of affordable childcare. And, in a community that has been disinvested in, that's seen as a place where public safety is an issue, for example, there's a lot of investment in, okay, how do we create workforce development? How do we address public safety issues by getting people in jobs? But in this context, for example, a lot of young people who might have been recruited to, let's say, workforce development programs that were just about job matching really were unable to hold on to jobs because there was this unmet need of like local affordable childcare in the community. And so this is a context where I was seeing and a part of conversations where people in the community were imagining and exploring how can, for example, co-ops meet this unmet need. How can it help create both work opportunities as well as a service, a basic service that doesn't exist in the community, affordable childcare. So that was my introduction and like really seeing firsthand the opportunities of co-ops in neglected communities, in helping to kind of where mainstream economies are not meeting the needs of communities, where public investment or the motives of public institutions are not lining up, and how communities can kind of create some of those solutions drive those solutions through co-ops.
I really appreciate that overview. And I think that many listeners might not be super familiar with what a worker-owned cooperative actually is. And I really appreciated the way you characterized our current economy. Can you please just give us a sense of what you mean by worker-owned cooperative and how it addresses these concerns you have about the way our economy is currently constructed?
Yeah, absolutely. So a worker co-op is a business that is owned and democratically managed by its workers. The idea is that workers are also owners of the business, and they participate in, they have equity, they contribute to the business, they have a share in it, and they also benefit from the profits, often the management, and they have a voice in shaping what that business looks like. The benefits of worker co-ops is that they can create and maintain dignified jobs. They can generate wealth and opportunities for the individuals. It's not necessarily extracting capital from the individuals who are a part of it. The people who really benefit from it are the people who are working in it. And it can also, promotes the building of community wealth. It often keeps wealth in the local community. Essentially, it's driven not just by creating profit, but also really meeting the needs of its members. And that's what a co-op in general will do. But in the context of a worker-owned co-op, it's really focused on meeting the needs of the worker owners.
I'm curious about this term co-op, because if people go to RAI, for example, that's a co-op, or maybe some people are in a community where there's a food co-op. But you're talking about something a little bit different, which is a worker-owned cooperative. Can you just distill the differences between those terms and how they differ functionally?
So a co-op, cooperative in general, is an organization that is owned and managed by a group of people, and it's designed to meet the needs of that group of people. And so the purpose is to meet the needs of the members, and who the members are affects what type of cooperative it is. So in the context of a worker co-op, it means it's owned by the staff, the employees, the people who are working within it. There's other models of co-ops where perhaps the consumers or the client, traditionally you think of them as clients, like the people who use what the co-ops create, might be the members of it. So food co-ops are a great example of that. The folks who are going to the grocery stores and buying things, that might be owned by the consumers. There's also examples of food co-ops that might have different classes and groups of members. So the workers, as well as the people who shop there, might both be members of the co-ops. And in those cases, the different interests and needs of both those groups of people will be represented in making decisions about the business. Both those groups of people will have an ability to democratically participate in decision making. They will have a level of sharing, and if the business does well and there's any kind of surplus profit to distribute. The thing that is standard is that regardless of what type of member you are, whether you're a worker or a consumer, every person has one vote and one vote in shaping the business. There's also other types of co-ops as well, such as housing co-ops that are owned by the residents who live in them. There's producer co-ops, which might be owned by, for example, farmers who are together a part of the co-op, but like aggregating what they are farming together. So the producers of goods or services. And so worker co-ops are just a distinct type of business where the workers themselves are actually owning and managing democratically controlling the business.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thank you so much. I guess I'm wondering about the logistics and the actual experience. Can you talk a little about, is it different for somebody to work in a worker-owned cooperative compared to another business? You're mentioning that they have more democratic control, but like, what's the day-to-day difference, or how is the feel difference between a worker-owned cooperative and a traditional business?
Yeah, that's a great question. Oftentimes this will depend on, the size of the business. For example, in a small, tightly run worker co-op, oftentimes the members, the workers will play a much bigger role in, for example, in the management of the co-op. Essentially, what does need to be standard is that they need to have a voice and a vote in making big decisions about the direction of the business and have the ability to participate in management. However, as you start to grow and scale, some of those managerial, administrative things might be delegated so there might still be management structures or people who are responsible for doing kind of like creating the budget or administering things. But ultimately, regardless of how big and how exactly you're structured, you need to be able to have a vote to determine big decisions about the business, how your business is being managed, and shape who kind of like your leadership is and how they approach the business. In a smaller worker co-op, as well as larger ones, workers might be able to run and be on the board. If it's a cooperative corporation, worker owners will have the ability to elect certain workers to sit on the board in order to exercise kind of democratic control over the business. In other smaller co-ops, if they don't have a board, it might be that they participate in committees that create policies around a specific aspect of the business. And so different types of co-ops, different structures of co-ops, as well as different sizes of co-ops have different versions of what it looks like to have that participatory element. But ultimately, the principle is that you need to be able to exercise democratic control and participate and have a voice, and ultimately, have a share in the profits. And if the business does well, you share in that. If the business is struggling, you also have a share in that. So it's really about having that sense of ownership over the business instead of just showing up as an employee, taking your paycheck, working, and then that's your full relationship to work.
You were mentioning earlier that there were a number of benefits to worker-owned cooperatives for the community in particular. And one thing you mentioned was basically keeping money in communities, but also meeting community needs. Can you say a little bit more about how any business, if it's worker-owned, how it would actually contribute directly to the community beyond just the confines of the business itself?
Yeah, that's a great question. It could be helpful to start with like a very specific type of example. And so maybe I'll speak to like the home care industry, for example, where there are worker cooperatives that have had a really big impact. And so, starting from the perspective of the workers, the care industry, for example, is a context where there is a lot of worker exploitation. There's the jobs are precarious. There's a lot of wage theft. And so the impact of that is that there's a lot of turnover in the industry. And we have a care crisis. We have an aging population. We have a lack of trained home caregivers. A lot of home care workers are immigrants, and immigrants. There's like a culture of demonizing immigrants in this country right now, and challenging immigration policies. And the impact of that is that a group of folks who have historically been a backbone of the home care industry, there's a need that's being unmet. And in this context, for example, the development of home care worker co-ops, where workers who have more of an ability to shape their workplaces, pay themselves fair wages, take care of their safety, their own well-being, and create jobs where there is better retention, there's better conditions, they're more likely able to show up and actually deliver really good care work. And care work, can be technical, but it's also really at its core humans taking care of other humans, and the well-being of the caregivers really impacts what kind of care they're able to offer. And I think this is something that almost everyone knows someone who's required home care or will need it at some point in their lives. And I think this is an example of how, a co-op, it is meeting the needs of workers, but it's also meeting an unmet need in our communities and our society. And usually, for example, co-ops, like zooming out a little bit, because they're so rooted in the community and the owners are based in the communities themselves, they're not likely to kind of evaluate the picture based on just like, okay, did we make enough profits? Should we close down this business? Should we move it? It's really rooted in responding to what the community needs. If like a business owner retires, the business is not likely to shut down and create this gap in the community. It's going to have a function and ability to be sustained and have new leadership and people carry this business on. Typically, they are also, because the profits and surpluses and benefits are going to workers in the community, it's usually not that these benefits are extracted by some absent owner who owns, a whole chain of home care agencies around the country. It's that those benefits are going back into the workers who live in the community, who are usually spending in the community and investing in the well-being of their communities. And so that will build community wealth. I think one thing we've seen is like a lot of times during economic recession or downturns, a lot of jobs are lost and a lot of businesses shut down. And co-ops have historically been a lot more resilient in these contexts and come up with creative ways to maintain jobs, to keep people working, even if at like a lower capacity, to prioritize holding onto these jobs, and also which creates sustainability of this type of truly often essential services that we rely on.
You're painting a very clear picture here. I really appreciate this. I think some listeners would be curious to know about, there's not that many worker-owned cooperatives, at least most people don't necessarily interact with them relative to the other places where they get sales and services and so forth. I guess I'm wondering, is this economically viable? It's so different than the current system of most private enterprises. The money is kind of being distributed. People might be worried about, is there enough profit? Are people making enough money? Is it legitimate and stable? You've basically just suggested that it is, but I guess could you just say more about that, given that most people don't know about these cooperatives and might be curious about the economic stability of them?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess I just want to say that a lot of industries and big corporations receive a lot of support and subsidies and financing and access to capital and benefits in order to be successful. Like there's this great injection of capital and free resources and support and tax benefits. And that's what leads them to be able to grow and scale. And I think co-ops have oftentimes been excluded from accessing, business supports and tax benefits and so on. And that, in context where we've seen co-ops receive that same kind of technical assistance, investment, access to capital, they have been able to thrive. And so I think that's one side of it, is just kind of understanding that most businesses and services do require public investment in order to be set up with a strong foundation and succeed. So it's really about figuring out ways that we can offer that equal playing field so that co-ops can compete effectively. I do think, on the flip side, where in any context where you're focused more on how do we make sure people are paid fairly, that they have good benefits, there's going to be less profit to be made. But ultimately, they are still able to be sustainable businesses if they're set up in the right way. And there's also opportunities for scale. I think something a lot of worker co-ops are looking at is how to create secondary co-ops where they can also experience some of those efficiencies of scale. What are those shared back office resources? What are those like shared marketing things that they can use together, as well as creating a stronger ecosystem of co-ops where they can kind of have a supply chain of co-ops where they can have preferential opportunities for co-ops. And so I think, it is challenging for one single co-op to have very wide-reaching impact, but where it's more likely to grow and succeed is when we can create this broader network of co-ops across multiple industries in ways where there can be, I think, more economic integration. One example of what this can look like, for example, in another country, is the Mondragon. And Mondragon is based in Basque Spain. I think Mondragon is an example of what's possible with worker co-ops, where you can economically expand and integrate and create a federation of worker co-ops across multiple industries. I think they showcase the strengths of worker co-ops well.
I really like the way you describe this as sort of like an ecosystem of cooperatives. It seems like we have the opposite for the most part in the U.S., where if you were dropped down in almost any city, you would just see nothing but corporate entities and not have that many choices. I guess, can you speak a little bit about, given that you're making a very strong case, I think very persuasively, that there's a lot of benefits to have worker-owned cooperatives, and yet we don't have that many relative to traditional businesses. What are some of the reasons why?
One of the primary reasons is actually just the lack of education around co-ops. I think there are histories and traditions of co-ops in this country, particularly, in rural communities and Black communities and immigrant communities where folks have had needs unmet by traditional markets and public institutions. But that being said, I don't think we necessarily elevate them. And I also don't think our institutions and are set up to support them. So for example, it's very hard for co-ops to get access to capital or loans. A lot of traditional loan providers don't really understand how co-ops work. To have multiple owners, to figure out who's responsible and how they put up personal guarantees for starting a business. We don't have that much kind of education and experience of what it's like to participate in democratic practices. I think when most people in this country think about democracy, they think about just casting a vote in, maybe multiple levels of elections, but not necessarily that, okay, here are the ways in which our livelihoods are tied up in each other. Here are the ways in which we need to participate actively in making decisions about how we want to use our resources. Here's how we jointly all have ownership and all have a voice that actually impacts our decisions and our policies, because it's not necessarily a huge part of mainstream culture and uplifted. I think that the default way that we understand entrepreneurship is, just to take it to an extreme, like a visionary solo entrepreneur comes up with an idea and makes it happen. It's not seen as how does a group of people come together and collectively envision something that can meet the needs of a whole group of people. And it can be a slow and hard process to really be engaging people and sharing their views and taking many perspectives into consideration and shaping things that work for everyone and making sure everyone understands how things are operating instead of kind of just imposing something from above. And so I think part of it is education. Part of it is that they're not necessarily set up to access the same kinds of resources or investment or capital that is really essential to their success. But I do think that historically, in moments, kind of more shock moments and moments where there are downturns and recessions. And that's oftentimes where co-ops do emerge. And, it is a challenging time. And it was during COVID and as COVID was peaking. And I think that these are the moments where I've seen in our work, like a lot more people reaching out, asking, what does it look like to replicate this model where we think of co-ops as a tool to create economic opportunity for workers who might be locked out of access to good jobs. Like more and more so, it really seeing this also coming from centers of where workers are being organized and people seeing, okay, creating these jobs, creating these high road jobs can be part of an economic development strategy, can be part of a community development strategy and building that ownership and control into our economy.
Yeah, and this is a nice segue to another question I had, which is, how do these get going? I mean, I don't need you to go into like the very specific legalities of it all, but just can you give us a broad overview of the ways in which, or some of the parameters, or some of the issues that need to be addressed to create a worker-owned cooperative?
There's two ways typically that worker co-ops get created. One is that they convert from being a more traditional form of business. And in this case, the business already exists and maybe the current owner wants to bring in the other workers to be owners as well. Maybe they're retiring. This is something that's happening as a lot of business owners are retiring and aging out, and sometimes like their business is a legacy business and they want to keep it going. They don't want to either shut it down or sell it to like a absent investor who isn't rooted in the community. And so the business might be sold to a group of workers to collectively own it. So that's one way. It's like a conversion from a traditional business. And then the other way to start up a worker co-op really involves a group of people coming together to set up that business together. Just like a traditional business, is often really important to be doing like feasibility studies and market analysis to see like, is what we're here to offer really addressing an unmet need in the community or in the market, and putting together that business plan. But I think the part that, adds like a lot of planning and a lot of groundwork is shaping the governance, like deciding how is it that we want to collectively govern this business, figuring out like where are the decision points where like everyone gets to weigh in, and where are the things that we're really just delegating this to an administrator or like or someone who is serving in management. How do we want to structure this business? And that's essentially outlined in bylaws or an operating agreement, which is just a document that describes like how is it that our co-op wants to function. So that is a really important part of it. Even before doing that, a big part is just people participating in co-op education to understand what democratic management looks like, understanding like as an owner what your rights are, but also like what your responsibilities are, how you can wear two hats as an owner as well as a worker, where are the opportunities to have a voice, and where do you need to kind of, when are you primarily focusing on serving the function of like offering a service or creating your product. There's that. And then like really working with finding like the right legal and financial service providers to help you understand like what are the legal implications of the structure that we create, what are like the financial implications, how does this affect our taxes, like how do we want to share profits, how much of our profits do we want to reinvest in growing the business versus like pay out our profits to individual worker owners each year. So there's just a lot of decisions to be made, and a lot of that can come out in like doing the business planning as well as the financial modeling of like how do we get this to be a sustainable business, and what kinds of partnerships are really critical to that as well.
I went to a talk a couple years ago in which somebody basically made the argument that state law in some cases prohibits worker-owned cooperatives. And I'm just wondering if that's true. And if listeners are interested in this, does everybody have access to creating a worker-owned cooperative, or are there constraints in different parts of the country?
Great question. So in terms of the entity type, different states have different laws around cooperative corporations, which is a legally recognized form of a cooperative. That being said, a very common way to create cooperatives is using the limited liability corporation LLC form, which is basically a blank canvas for you to create an outline of how you want your business to function. And that is really commonly used because LLCs are standard across the country and may not have as many of those restrictions or limitations as like a cooperative corporation might, which will also differ according to what state you're in. Anyone can create an LLC cooperative and participate as an owner and receive benefits as an owner. You know, LLCs are a blank canvas. They've been used for a lot of like shielding people from scrutiny. They've been used for, I think, questionable purposes. And they're also, I think, a tool that can be used to create the form of a co-op or some structure that people might be designing. So that is something that is standard and accessible regardless of where people might be based.
I'm wondering, again, you've painted a very clear, persuasive picture about this. I'm just wondering about the sort of support across the country. Is this a partisan issue? Is there bipartisan support for cooperatives? How do you think about that?
There's interest and support for the idea of employee ownership across party lines. There's a cultural acceptance in like the idea of entrepreneurs who pull themselves up from their bootstraps and participate in the economy and create value in the economy. And I think there's a way to really make that case, like regardless of someone's political leanings. This is a way to equip people to be able to be entrepreneurs in a collective way and in order to pave their economic path. And I think that's the part that is a message that really can resonate for a lot of people. A very important part of worker co-ops is the democratic participation and the kind of culture that it creates where people see the power of like exercising their voice and learn how to be in community in a way that's kind of understands that our livelihoods and survival and resilience is tied up with each other. And I think like where we start to connect cooperativism to the solidarity economy, to building an alternative economy where, you know, we see participation, democratic participation, we see collective control of, you know, it starts with a business, but it can also look like participatory democracy and collective control of public institutions, of, you know, participatory budgeting reflects a lot of, you know, this type of cooperative value. And I think where co-ops will be most powerful is like when they're connected to that broader solidarity economy and social movements. And I think that's like a connection that might, I think, generate some fear and questioning for a lot of people is like, you know, what are we really tying this to? But I think the power of co-ops is, you know, they are on the one hand, such a practical and immediate way for people to meet their needs in a way that's very uniting. You know, if you're in a rural area and your utilities don't reach where you are, you and your neighbors, regardless of like what your political leanings are going to see a need to come together to create a co-op to access electric, to access water, to, you know, access internet. Like there's this like very practical side of like meeting basic necessities. And it can open the door to really seeing the opportunities for broader cooperative structures and bringing that into how we interact with public institutions and reimagining how our economy and our political system is structured. So I think there's definitely very important ways to bring different people into seeing the opportunities of co-ops as well.
Can you just give us a sort of a status report? I'm just wondering how many cooperatives there are relative to regular businesses? And also, can you speak to this notion that you're getting at, this ecosystem? Are we moving towards a society in which there are more integrated cooperatives? What's the state of the cooperative landscape?
Co-ops are definitely a fraction, like a very small part of our economy right now, even though worker co-ops are growing, and worker co-ops are the most rapidly growing type of co-op. Credit unions are a type of cooperative, not a worker-owned co-op, but a type of co-op. And I think I saw a number the other day that was like 1 in 4 or 5 Americans are actually part of a credit union, like are part of some type of cooperative, including credit unions, which make up a lot of that participation. But most of them wouldn't consider that a co-op or know what that means. And so I think there is actually a lot of participation already. That being said, there's not necessarily a lot of education or understanding, or, maybe people are part of these credit unions, but maybe they're not participating in the voting side, which is part of the opportunity and benefit of being a member. In terms of where we're at in building co-op ecosystems in our country, there are cities and contexts where, particularly I think where local and county governments are seeing the opportunity for building this kind of co-op ecosystem. There's budding energy for this. That being said, I think we are still very far away from building a strong co-op ecosystem in the U.S. But I think that there are models and that we can look to, whether it's in Canada or Italy or Spain and, Mexico and places where we can see more of these traditions and this integration of co-ops across industries in the economy.
We mostly think about worker-owned cooperatives from this perspective of the worker and the owner, but there's also the consumers. And I personally have a very strong connection to several worker-owned cooperatives. Most people have never heard of worker-owned cooperatives or maybe don't realize that they're frequenting them. I'm just wondering, from your experience as a consumer, do you have experiences with worker-owned cooperatives as a consumer that you can share that you think are important insights for those people who maybe not have heard of worker-owned cooperatives?
Yes, absolutely. I was speaking to home care recently, and in New York City, the Cooperative Home Care Associates, based out of the Bronx, they're the largest worker co-op in the country, and they are an example of a home care worker co-op where they've really been able to scale and expand. And I know folks who have been clients of this home care worker co-op, and in an industry where there's just a lot of turnover, there's a lot of, poor working conditions for home care workers. This has been a context where people have really experienced a very different kind of care that they get, and as well as investment in building the skills and the training and education and the growth of home care worker owners. With CHCA, for example, these folks have really spoken to how does this change the type of care that we're able to get?
I do want to end with a couple of personal questions, but before we get there, I'd just like to hear some final thoughts from you about this. Seems like a really important model. It has all these benefits, and yet it's a minuscule proportion of total businesses. What do you think needs to happen for worker-owned cooperatives to have a larger role in our society?
I think a really important opportunity for expanding worker ownership is public investment in this model. Actually, at the Democracy at Work Institute, one of our most powerful kind of programs was through the California Seed program, which was supported through funding from California State Employment Training Panel, which focused on investing in entrepreneurship for people who traditionally were locked out of access to good jobs. This program, allowed us, the Democracy at Work Institute, to partner with 5 Southern California-based worker centers and community organizations that were already organizing workers in a range of different industries, and partnering with them to kind of create models for how to create high road, dignified jobs through cooperatives in industries in California. And I think that was one very powerful model where the state invested in education, in training, and in making sure that, for example, small business services that are available in general have the education and co-op awareness that they need to support co-ops. There's also opportunities for cities and states to think about procurement for how to kind of see cooperative businesses, maybe along the lines of minority women-owned businesses, and like giving preferential opportunities to these types of businesses to incentivize them and seeing the benefits they offer workers as well as communities. And by investing in these types of, by investing in creating preferential procurement opportunities for these types of businesses that can also contribute to the growth of co-ops. So I think that's a really important part is through partnerships with cities and states that see the value of co-ops as an economic development strategy, and something that can create, I think, more economic resilience.
Are we moving in the right direction? What's your own personal take on the status of work-owned cooperatives?
I think we are. I think worker co-ops are being seen as an opportunity for economic development and community development. I think that there is a growing slowly, but growing level of kind of proficiency from more partners who provide technical assistance and access to non-extractive capital that is really necessary for startup co-ops. That's not necessarily dispersed evenly across the country. I think there are areas where that's more concentrated. And so I think more needs to be done to figure out how to get that proficiency and those resources spread out in areas where there's less of like a concentration of co-op folks. I think that there has been this growing interest and movement in the co-op conversion space, especially given the silver tsunami of aging business owners around the country. And so there has been an interest and investment in making sure more of these legacy businesses and jobs are preserved, and that conversions can be a way of keeping those businesses open and ensuring that those ownership and the jobs stay owned by stay in the community. So there has been growth and interest there. I think that generally there's opportunity and there's interest, and that's a good thing. And also it is still kind of a niche thing that needs to enter more, I think, mainstream awareness and really be introduced to people early on. We don't have a lot of, I think, even at like the college level, there aren't a lot of universities and contexts where this is introduced as just a way to do business. So I think that's also something that is like a really big opportunity that's starting to shift. The City University of New York has an amazing workplace democracy and community ownership certificate that's bringing this into academic institutions as well. I know that New York City, and I'm just speaking to New York because that's what I know about, there's participatory budgeting in a lot of schools as a way of introducing people to cooperative practices and participatory democracy. I think that there's some growth in these things, but there is a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I really appreciate that perspective. Thank you so much. And I just want to end with 3 personal questions, which you can relate to the work you're doing or move beyond it. And the first is, what do you see in society that gives you inspiration and energy?
Everywhere I look around me, I see people like continuing to be creative and to come up with ways to create connections with new people, to share information, to come together and like still find ways to just experience joy and to share limited resources to build simple things that are going to just like help us get through each week and each particular challenge. I think I'll say, just to be a little bit more specific, in my work, it's been pretty incredible to see how adaptive people can be in seeing that the ground beneath us is moving every day. You know, things that we take for granted are changing. Things that that have historically been interpreted in one way, whether they're laws or other norms, are changing. Seeing people be adaptive in the ways that they organize, in the ways that they share information, in the ways that they protect each other, in the ways that they hustle and create economic opportunities. It's just been, I think, very inspiring. You know, we have everyone has a moment and a time to reel and to grieve, but also there's so much of just bouncing back to figure out, okay, how are we going to get through this moment? And like, what are the resources and information and assets that we do have? And there is just, I see a lot of creativity and adaptiveness everywhere I look, both in the co-op space as well as just in my local community.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. The next question is, I'm wondering if you have any examples of something you've seen or heard or listened to or read recently that has made you think in new ways or more deeply about your work or the current moment in society.
I think there's two books that are on my bookshelf that I love, that I think that are really powerful opportunities to think about cooperativism, its roots, what we can draw from, as well as ways to integrate cooperative principles in like a lot of different structures and institutions. One of them is Collective Courage by Jessica Gordon Nembhard, which draws from, in our country, like the history of African American cooperativism, and also We Decide by Mike Menser, which is a book that I think showcases a lot of examples and draws from other countries of ways in which economic democracy has been practiced and cultivated. Participatory democracy has been practiced and cultivated. I think those models are just very interesting to kind of imagine what could exist and what it could be like to build a culture where we see those things as normal.
Yeah, thank you for those recommendations. And then lastly, I'm wondering, as you work in this society and there's lots of problems and so forth, is there anything that gives you a sense of peace and joy?
I mean, probably seasonal cycles and the way natural things regenerate even after they, either they die each winter or they suffer some natural or man-made disaster. Like seeing the way things can move through the cycles of kind of dying and then coming back to life. I recently fractured my ankle, and just like the experience of watching and experiencing a body part, a bone, an ankle, just be able to heal itself just through time and just through like care and the space to heal, as well as just like it's springtime. It's been a hard, long, dark winter, and just watching plants grow and just remembering that, there's a lot that naturally wants to regenerate and grow and heal. And I think we can draw a lot of inspiration from that, even when it feels like things are dark and barren and challenging, and a lot of the things that have been invested in might feel like they're being slashed or under duress. And also like there is this like regeneration and growth that we can count on with, care and energy, especially when we have people around us to go through that with.
I really like that sentiment. Thank you so much for sharing. And thank you so much for making time. It's been lovely talking with you.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian.
I have been wanting to talk to somebody about worker-owned cooperatives for a long time. I'm personally really interested in worker-owned cooperatives and curious about the role they could play in our society. And Nina just gave a fantastic overview of the landscape of worker-owned cooperatives and how she sees them ameliorating some of the problems in our society. I really appreciated her expertise and insights and enjoyed talking with her. As always, I want to thank the executive producers of Crossing the Chasm, Dan Phillips and Cody Bayless. Thanks, as always, to Anodyne Diversion for the music. And thanks to you all for listening in. I hope you enjoyed the show.